Hey everybody, Ryan here at etrailer.com. Today on our 2018 Ram 3500, we're going to be taking a look at and showing you how to install the DeeZee truck bed auxiliary fuel tank. And we'll be doing that in conjunction with the DeeZee connector kit. And since it does tie into our factory fuel tank, we can either increase the overall capacity of our truck's fuel system, or we can close the valve off and use this as an auxiliary tank. So whether you're using it around the farm or the job site, you could even put a pump in here. It's going to get both things done. Now, one of the things I really like about this tank is that it's going to be a little more compact than some of the other ones. From the front of our truck bed here to the edge of the tank, it's going to be about 9 1/4 inches. And that measurement's going to help you figure out how much space it's going to take up in the front of your truck. Now, as far as the overall length of our tank, it's going to be 59 1/2 inches. So when it's centered here in the bed of our truck, we're going to have about 2 1/2 inches or so on each side. And that's still going to give us plenty of room to be able to get a tow strap around our hook. And plenty of room to get your hand down here and turn your valve. So for those shippers or those long distance journeys, you're going to be able to spend more time on the road because you're not going to have to stop and fill up so much. It's also going to work good for those work trucks. You're not going to have to fiddle around every day filling up those small gas cans. You can fill up your tank and be good for a few days. Now, many of our customers ask if they're able to use a tonneau cover with our tank. Now, even though the top of the tank is pretty much flush with the top of the bed, our cap is going to stick up a couple inches. So more times than not, we're probably not going to be able to use that cover. The tank itself is going to be made from aluminum, so not only is it going to be lightweight, we're not going to have to worry about it rusting. Now I'll show you how it works. In this case, I have my valve in this position, so it is closed. You can come up here and open up our tank. So now we can take some fuel and pour it in. Once you filled it up, go ahead and pop your lid back on. Now, if you want to keep the fuel inside of our aluminum tank isolated, you'd simply just leave your valve in the off position. But if you wanted it to go down into our factory tank, you'd flip it down to open it up. Now, inside of our tank, we're going to have 3 stability baffles. And what those are going to do is help eliminate any sloshing from side to side. Now, one more thing I like about this tank is that we're going to have an option on which side to fill it up from. On the driver's side, we have our cap, but if you wanted to, over here on the passenger side, you could remove this plug and put the cap over here, or you could even remove this and use it for a pump. In this day and age, with everything being so high tech, it's actually quite refreshing to see something so simple but yet effective. And it's actually not too bad to install either. Speaking of which, let's go ahead and do it together now. To begin our install, I went ahead and set our tank on the tailgate of our truck, and we're going to be working over here on the driver's side by this bung. We're going to need to remove this plug and replace it with a shutoff valve. Just take an Allen key and pull it out. Now we're going to take our shutoff valve and on the threads put some sealer. That way we don't have to worry about any leaks or anything like that. We can go ahead and screw this into the bung. Now we're going to do the same thing with our fitting. Make sure to get that thread sealer on there. And we can screw it into our valve. You're going to want the end of it to face down towards the bed. That way the fuel can run down. You don't want to get these too tight, but you do want them tight enough to where it's not going to leak. I went ahead and took our tank and pushed it up to the front of our bed and centered it where you'd want it to be. That way we can mark the spots that we need to drill for our attachment points. We're going to have 4 attachment points, 1 on each side of the tank. So I'll just use a paint pen through the hole to get it marked. And we're going to have 2 more at the base of the tank, 1 on each side. We're going to have 1 more spot that we need to mark. That's over here by the valve, because a hose is going to get attached to this and run down through the bed. So I went ahead and marked it right there. With everything marked, we can go ahead and move our tank out of the way and get ready to drill. Now before we drill our holes, it's very important that you go underneath the truck and make sure there's nothing down there that we can accidentally hit and damage. Now once all of our mounting holes are drilled, we can then drill a hole for our fuel line. Now I'm going to start it with a pilot bit, and then we're going to enlarge it to 3/4 of an inch. That's a good idea on our fuel line hole that we made to file down any burrs or sharp edges. That way our rubber line doesn't get damaged. Now what I'm going to do, just to help prevent any rust or anything like that, I'm going to put a shot of some clear spray paint over all the holes that we drilled. Now we're going to connect our fuel line to our barbed fitting. Now before you put it on, you're going to want to take one of the hose clamps, slide it over your hose, and then this will just push on over the barbs. It can be a tight fit, so you're just going to have to work it up until we get it all the way in place. And once it's in place, take your hose clamp and tighten it down. I'll take the other end of our fuel line and push it down into the hole that we made for it. And we can kind of simultaneously work our tank back into position as we drop that line down through the opening. Now we can line up our tank with all of our attachment points and loosely secure it. Now keep in mind, our tank does not come with any hardware, so you're going to have to provide that yourself. Now what I'm going to do is take a bolt and a flat washer, and from the back of the front of our bed, run that through the bed and our mounting tab on our tank, and then secure it with another flat washer, a lock washer, and then a nut. And this is what our hardware looks like on this side. Now keep in mind, you just want to get these hand tight. That way our tank does have a little wiggle room if we need it. Now on our bottom tabs, there's going to be a bit of a gap because of the corrugation in our bed. So what I'm going to do is use a spacer block. I just happen to have this laying around. But what you could do if you run into this problem, you can make these, or you could just use some regular flat washers. Those will work just fine too. I'm going to put that underneath. That'll just help give it a little more support. Drop our bolt through. Now we're going to come to the bottom side of the truck, and this is where our bolts drop through for the bottom tank attachment points. And we're going to put our fasteners on it. Again, I'm going to use a flat washer, a lock washer, and a nut. I'm going to do the same thing over on the other side. With all of our hardware in place and hand tight, now we can snug it on down. Now we're going to start working on our fuel fill line. We're going to be right here in this area underneath by our fuel door. Now where we're going to be working is right here where our factory fuel filler neck is. The first thing we're going to do is disconnect one of these vent lines from our filler neck by cutting this zip tie. gonna just pull that over to the side. Then we're gonna have to disconnect 2 hose clamps. One here and one here. We'll start with the smaller one first. Grab a 7mm socket and back that clamp off. What we're trying to do is we're going to loosen it enough to where we can bring it off the rubber hose onto the metal portion. So once you have it loose, if you have to kind of spin it to get a better angle on it to loosen it up more, it can help sometimes. Now for the larger clamp here on our main filler tube, we're going to use an 8mm socket to loosen that up. We are going to have a little ground wire attached to the frame right here that is connected to our tubes at that bracketry. So we're going to disconnect that too using a 10mm socket. With our clamps out of the way, what we're going to do now is separate our rubber lines from our metal ones. So what you can do is kind of just work around the edge with your hand, or you can use a plastic trim tool like this to help give you a little leverage. I like to use the plastic tools because then you ain't got to worry about a flathead screwdriver cutting your hose or anything like that. What we're going to do now is open up our fuel door and remove 3 T25 Torx bit screws. Now our fill neck is more or less going to be completely disconnected. We're going to kind of work it down towards the bottom of the truck. Now you don't want to go too crazy because our DEF lines are still attached and they are bendable, but they are plastic, so just keep that in mind. Try not to kink those up or put them in a bind or anything like that. Now once we got it down right here, it's just going to be a lot easier to work with. So now we need to cut a portion of our main fill line off. That way we can use our adapter for our tank and our bed. Now instead of cutting our main pipe in half and putting this in place, our barb on our adapter actually fits perfectly into the factory rubber hose up top. So I'm just going to cut the end off. And that way we only have one point where we cut and it'll be less prone to leak. So I'll line up one end with the other and mark it. That way we know where to cut. Now we can very carefully cut the end of our tube off. Now I'm going to use a Dremel tool to do this. However, you can use a Sawzall or even a hand saw. Just be patient, take your time, and make sure you do the cut right. And once I get it cut all the way around with the exception of this small gap here, what I'm going to do is just kind of work it back and forth to not risk damaging this pipe. After you work it for a moment, it should break free, and then we can kind of come back and clean up that edge. Now with the piece out of the way, what I'm going to do is just kind of file this edge down, clean everything out, make sure there's no loose metal shavings. So now we can put our rollover valve into our adapter. What we're going to do is, once again, on the threads of it, use some sealant. And we can run this down into our adapter. So now we can take one of the included couplers, push that over the adapter. Normally I try to split the difference as far as the width of our coupler. I try to run it halfway on our adapter, and the other half will be for the filler neck. We'll kind of get that down, about like that. We'll take a hose clamp that is included and tighten that down around the coupler and our adapter. Now we're going to take our adapter and put it over our fill tube. Put our hose clamp on first and push it on. Now I do want to point out, whenever you tighten this down, you're going to kind of want to eyeball it, and we're going to want the barb facing up, and I actually pointed it a little towards our smaller fuel hose that goes up into the tank in our bed, and that way the gravity will work in our favor and be ideal. We can push that on. So now with our adapter completely on, we can lift our filler neck back into position and put it back over our hoses. Now for the time being, we're just going to get them started a little bit, leave them unconnected. That way we can still move it around a little bit and connect our last fuel line up here. So we're going to take our hose coming from our tank in the bed and just run it over to our barb here in our adapter on that roll valve, and just kind of eyeball the length. So we'll pull that hose somewhat tight, but not super tight, and keep our finger there where we need to cut it. Then we'll trim off that excess hose that we don't need. We can take our smaller hose clamp that's included, slide it over our hose, and push it into place over our barb fitting. Once we feel that it's all the way on there, then take our hose clamp, slide it into place, and tighten it down. I went ahead and made sure our hoses were fully seated onto our adapter and the other two. And once I verified that, I went ahead and used those factory hose clamps to tighten them down. Since that's done, we can now take our ground wire and reattach that back to the stud on the frame. Now we can come back up here to our fuel door and line our 3 holes back up and re-secure it using the 3 factory torque bit screws that we removed earlier. Now once everything is connected, it's a good idea to come back down underneath and secure anything that is loose, particularly our small fuel line. And I just did that with some zip ties. And that'll do it for our look at and our installation of the DeeZee truck bed auxiliary fuel tank on our 2018 Ram 3500.